2017 Scriptural Literal Calendar. This is an important presentation, helping us to walk through the ancient scriptures of the Hebrew Scrolls. We will journey as our ancestors sojourned. We will seek out discoveries, searching for simple ways of following after our Almighty Creator, the Father. From within our calendar study, we discovered that the Sabbath cycle is from sunset to sunset, and this we believe is the definition of the Sabbath day. Within this brief presentation we will discuss the topic of the Lunar Sabbath calendar, and what the scriptures will unveil about this doctrine. So hold on, and let's go. Since this presentation is a summary overview, we do not have the time to discuss our basic teaching disclaimer. Within the Part 1 presentation of this series, you will find a summary overview. However, for our full teaching on the subject, please refer to our presentation, Basic Teaching Disclaimer, a full study. We also do not have the time to discuss our basic electronic study tools. Within the Part 1 presentation of this series, you will also find a summary overview. However, to view our full teaching on the subject, please refer to our presentation, Basic Electronic Study Tools. Now that we understand the definition of the literal day, and the definition of the Sabbath cycle, from Part 1 of this series, let us now look at when is the Sabbath day, and how are we to define the week. In order for us to truly understand the scriptures, we need to totally forget what men teach, and we must concentrate only on the instructions of the Father, Yahuwah, our Elohim.
Jeremiah 17, 5-7, quote, "Thus said Yahuwah, cursed is the man who does trust in man, and has made flesh his arm, and from Yahuwah, whose heart turns. And he has been as a naked thing in a desert, and does not see when good comes, and has inhabited parched places in a wilderness, a salt land, and not inhabited. Baruch is the man who trusts in Yahuwah, and whose confidence has been Yahuwah." End quote. Deuteronomy 4, 5-6, quote, "See, I have taught you statutes and judgments just as Yahuwah, my Elohim had instructed me, for you to do thus within the land where you are entering to tenant it. And you must observe and obey them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the eyes of all the peoples who shall hear of all these statutes and will say, surely this great nation is a people wise and understanding." End quote.
There are so many verses speaking of wisdom within the scriptures. These are only a few, but the idea that we are presenting to you are as follows. Those who do the will of the Father, those who keep the commandments are the sheep who follow the shepherd. The Father gives wisdom and understanding to those whom know him and follow him. Our advice and opinion is this: if you don't understand something within the Word, pray and seek wisdom as you practice righteousness, walking after the Son, while keeping the commandments of the Father.
Genesis 2, 1-3, quote, "And finished are the heavens and the earth and all their host. And finishing is the Elohim, on the 6th day, his work which he does. And ceasing is he on the 7th day from all his work which he does. And Baruch is the Elohim the 7th day, and hallowing it, for in it he ceases from all his work, which the Elohim creates to make." End quote.
Now here is the question that everyone should be asking: when are we to keep the Sabbath? From the scriptures that we just read, Genesis chapter 2 verses 1-3, we are instructed that the weekly Sabbath is on the 7th day, at the end of the 7-day week, and no other time. There can only be a 7-day week, according to these verses we just read. The new week begins the day after the Sabbath, the day after the 7th day, thus the new week begins on day 1, of the 7-day week. The new week can only start after the Sabbath day, after the 7th day of the week. This is like the chicken and the egg paradox. The feast and festival Sabbath days are based upon the beginning of the new year, in which we will go into great detail within Part 3 of this series. But what about the Lunar Sabbath calendar? Can this be the true definition of the week and the Sabbath days? We will investigate this, by keeping within the writings of the ancient scrolls. Here let us now look into the Lunar Sabbath calendar, LSC, which is based upon the lunar cycles, and there are many people who keep, and believe that this calendar is scriptural. The Lunar Sabbath calendar states that the first week of the month starts at the new moon, and that the first day of the first week of the month is a new moon day. The Lunar Sabbath calendar states that the new moon day is not a working day nor is it a Sabbath day, but it is classified as a whole new type of day, a third type of day. The Lunar Sabbath calendar states that the 8th day of the month is the first Sabbath day. This is because we are instructed to work 6 days, and given that the first day of the month is a new moon day, thus the 8th day of the month becomes the first Sabbath of the month. From there the 15th, the 22nd and the 29th are all Sabbath days, and this pattern repeats every month. The Lunar Sabbath calendar states that during the last week of the month, there are some leftover days, because the lunations are approximately 29.5 days long, and therefore there are times where the month will have 29 days and other times the month will have 30 days. So what do we do on this leftover day? Do we work or do we rest? If the 29th of the month is a Sabbath and then the next day is a new moon day, what are we going to do on this new moon day? Do we work or do we rest? Maybe we pretend this day is dark and that it is simply just hidden. And what do we do when there are 30 days in the month? In this case we have 2 unaccountable days that we have to find some use for. Let's look at this calendar as others have graphically presented it. Here is the typical Lunar Sabbath calendar as presented by followers of this doctrine. Here the author has labeled this the IAUA sacred calendar. Here is another view of the typical Lunar Sabbath calendar as presented by followers of this doctrine. Here the author has labeled this the astro-lunisolar calendar. Here the author has given us what they believe is a view into the calendar of the actual creation week and month. Here is another view of the typical Lunar Sabbath calendar as presented by followers of this doctrine. Here the author has labeled this the YHWH calendar. Here again is another view of the typical Lunar Sabbath calendar as presented by followers of this doctrine. Here the author has labeled this the Creator's lunisolar calendar. Note here in the yearly view of their calendar that some months have 29 days and some months have 30 days. Here the author has shown what they believe is the calendar for the year AD 31, where I can only assume by the graphics shown, that they believe is the year that the Messiah was sacrificed. The typical Lunar Sabbath calendar brings much confusion, and many have attempted to debunk this calendar, but we believe that all men are prideful and arrogant, and once their minds are made up, they might as well have their doctrines carved in stone. There are way too many details within the Lunar Sabbath calendar, in order for us to debunk it, and we don't really want to waste our time on this man-made doctrine. However, there is one simple explanation for the Lunar Sabbath calendar, and that is confusion. We all understand who the author of confusion is, therefore we can only assume that the author of this calendar is the author of confusion. One easy and final way to prove the Lunar Sabbath calendar is false, and that this is simply a man-made invention, is found within the ancient scroll, Leviticus chapter 23, verses 15 through 17.
Leviticus 23, 15 through 17, quote, "You will count off for yourselves from the morrow after the first Sabbath, from the day you bring the sheaf of the wave offering, there shall be 7 flawless Sabbaths. Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath you shall count off 50 days, then you will bring near an approach present of new grain to Yahuwah. From your dwellings shall you bring bread as a wave offering, 2 loaves, of 2/10 of an ephah of flour shall they be, baked with leaven shall they be, as first fruits for Yahuwah." End quote.
Here we can simply understand this is the counting of the Omer, for the summer feast of weeks, or Shavuot. This passage instructs us to count the weeks between the first fruits of Passover to the first fruits of Shavuot, or the day of Pentecost. Here we can understand that within Leviticus chapter 23, verses 15 through 17, that from the morrow after the first Sabbath, we are to count 7 Sabbaths, or 7 weeks. This means, we are simply counting the weeks to Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, and this is the counting of 7 full weeks, which will equal 49 days. That is 7 days, times 7 weeks, equals 49 days. The day after the 7th Sabbath equals the 50th day. 49 plus 1 equals 50. Pentecost means 50 days. This is the definition of the Penida, 50. From first fruits, within the middle of the first month, counting forward 50 days will end in the 3rd month of the year. Thus naturally there should be 2 new moon days and 1 or 2 additional days for the 30th day of the month, if we hold to the Lunar Sabbath calendar. Thus the counting of the Omer for the Lunar Sabbath calendar would require at least 53 days, or 54 days, using the Lunar Sabbath calendar. The 50th day must be the day after the 7th Sabbath, as per the written law found within Leviticus chapter 23, verses 15 through 17. Thus the Lunar Sabbath calendar cannot be correct, and can be debunked with one simple scripture. The Lunar Sabbath calendar fails the Leviticus chapter 23, counting of the Omer test. Just to make sure, let us count the Omer on their own Lunar Sabbath calendars, to ensure that we did not miss anything. Okay, here we are simply adding in the numbers of the counting of the Omer, on top of one of the calendars that we presented previously. Here we are looking at the first month of the year, and that we will need to start the counting of the Omer on the day after the Sabbath within Passover, which according to this calendar is the 15th of the month. Thus the 16th of the month is the day after the Sabbath, and is the day of first fruits according to this calendar, which is day 1, of the Omer count. At the end of each week we also showed the counting of the Sabbaths. Here we are simply continuing the Omer count into the second month of the year. Notice that in the previous month we had 30 days, and again here in month 2, we are showing 30 days in the month. Also we can clearly see that we have a new moon day at the beginning of the second month. Here we are simply continuing the Omer count into the third month of the year. Again we can clearly see that we have a new moon day at the beginning of the third month. Simply the counting of the Omer to the day after the seventh Sabbath clearly fails. Counting of the Omer within the lunar Sabbath calendar yields us 53 days count, or 54 days count, to the day after the seventh Sabbath. Is not the Feast of Weeks the counting of 50 days from first fruits? Pentecost equals 50 days and not 54 days. The lunar Sabbath calendar simply fails the Leviticus chapter 23 test. This man-made doctrine is easily debunked if one would only look to the scriptures.
Exodus 20, 8-11, quote, "You are to remember the Sabbath day to hallow it. 6 days shall you serve and do all your work, yet the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahuwah your Elohim. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your servant or your maidservant, your bull, your donkey or your beast, or your sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahuwah dealt with the heavens and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he stopped on the seventh day. Therefore, Yahuwah Baruch the Sabbath day and hallowed it." End quote.
Here we are instructed to work 6 days, but within the lunar Sabbath calendar we have this issue at the end of the month. What are we to do with these days? What are we to do with the 30th day, and what are we to do with the new moon day? It is clearly instructed that these days cannot be work days, because we are told that we must work 6 days, and it is clear that there are not 6 days available here at the end of the month for us to work. It is also clear that these days cannot be rest days, because we are told to work 6 days and then we are commanded to rest on the 7th day. Here we would be resting for 3 days in a row, and not just resting on the 7th day. Therefore the lunar Sabbath calendar fails the 10 commandment test of Exodus chapter 20, verses 8-11. We believe that we have made an honest, clear, and accurate presentation of the lunar Sabbath calendar. We believe that just the 2 scriptures that we presented here within this teaching should be enough to clearly debunk this man-made doctrine.
Genesis 2, 1-3, quote, "And finished are the heavens and the earth and all their host. And finishing is the Elohim, on the 6th day, his work which he does. And ceasing is he on the 7th day from all his work which he does. And Baruch is the Elohim the 7th day, and hallowing it, for in it he ceases from all his work, which the Elohim creates to make." End quote. Exodus 31, 16, quote, "Hence the sons of Israel will keep the Sabbath so as to make the Sabbath an Aeonian covenant throughout their generations." End quote.
Here we can see that the Sabbath is a covenant between mankind and the Almighty Creator, for all generations, including our generation and the generations to come. It is no surprise that the author of confusion would have his hands within this statute, attempting to deceive, and derail as many as possible. Thus you can find all manner of misleading and deceptive teachings concerning the Sabbath and the Sabbath days. This is why we are creating this short presentation, because, to us, this truly is a life and death matter. Either you are within the covenant, or you are not within the covenant. Either you will be granted life or you will face the second death. The Sabbath is also a sign of those who are within the covenant with the Almighty Creator.
Exodus 31, 13, quote, "Now you speak to the sons of Israel saying, Surely, my Sabbaths shall you keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations to know that I Yahuwah, am hallowing you." End quote. Leviticus 23, 3, quote, "6 days shall work be done, yet on the 7th day there shall be a Sabbath of cessation, a Kodesh meeting. You shall do no work at all. This is a Sabbath to Yahuwah, in all your dwellings." End quote. Leviticus 23, 14, quote, "It shall be an Aeonian statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings." End quote. Leviticus 23, 21, quote, "It shall be an Aeonian statute in all your dwellings throughout your generations." End quote. Leviticus 23:31, quote, "It is an Aeonian statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings." End quote. Leviticus 23:41, quote, "It shall be an Aeonian statute throughout your generations." End quote.
We will leave this slide up for you to ponder on while we share the following. We share these scriptures with you, because many will say that these commandments are done away with or finished, and that the Passover sacrifice was done, once for all men. But this is not what these scriptures are communicating to us. Leviticus chapter 23 is not written to the Levites or to the priest working within the temple, but these commandments are for the children of the Father, and those who seek to be his children, his set-apart ones. Within this chapter we can see clearly that the Father is speaking to us. He starts the chapter by instructing Moses to, quote, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the appointed seasons of Yahuwah, those which you shall proclaim Kodesh meetings, my appointed seasons, they are these." End quote. These commandments are for us to do. These are for us to do now today, in our time and place, and not just until the Messiah comes, or until the Messiah comes again. The scriptures clearly state, quote, "It shall be an Aeonian statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings." End quote. That means that these scriptures are for us here now on this earth, for us to do in our dwellings, and for all generations to come. This to us does not appear to be something that can be nailed to a cross, or completed at Calvary. This chapter is part of the everlasting covenant with the Father. Please let no man deceive you into not keeping these commandments. Every word of the Father is true and good and will lead to life everlasting.
John 14:6, quote, "Yahushua is saying to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one is coming to the Father except through me." End quote. 1 John 2:1-5, quote, "My little children, these things am I writing to you that you may not be sinning. And if anyone should be sinning, we have an entreater with the Father, Yahushua, the just. And he is the propitiatory shelter concerned with our sins, yet not concerned with ours only, but concerned with the whole world also. And in this we know that we know him, if we should be keeping his precepts. He who is saying that, I know him and is not keeping his precepts, is a liar, and the truth of Yahuwah is not in this one. Yet whoever may be keeping his word, truly in this one the love of Yahuwah is perfected." End quote. 1 John 3:4, quote, "Everyone who is doing sin is doing lawlessness also, and sin is lawlessness." End quote. Everyone who is doing sin is doing lawlessness also, and sin is lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness.
This has been a brief investigation into the doctrine of the Lunar Sabbath calendar. This was an expanded breakout session from our investigation into our presentation, Walking the Calendar, Part 2, Defining the Sabbath. As part of the study, to define when we are to keep the weekly Sabbath, we first needed to clarify whether the Lunar Sabbath calendar was valid, and we have now discovered the following. The Lunar Sabbath calendar fails the Leviticus chapter 23, counting of the Omer test, and the Exodus chapter 20 Sabbath day commandment. We would like to thank you for your time and attention to this important presentation. Please continue the journey with us, Walking the Calendar, as we will investigate deeply into the commandments, laws, statutes, and the Sabbaths, and what they mean to us here today, in these end times. For now, Maranatha, may he come quickly.